Hello and welcome to Curiosity Cake. I'm your host Lee Delaney. On this episode I'm talking to author Stephen Uzzell and discussing his book I Am Juden, which is a historical fiction novel based on the real life of Haim Michael Klar. Klar was a Jewish person who impersonated a Nazi officer in order to help and protect Jews during the Second World War. He even ended up at Auschwitz, where survivors described him as a guardian angel. As always, hit the subscribe button, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser and Good Pods, and follow me on Twitter and Instagram. But for now, get yourself a cup of tea, grab a fork and dig into a slice of Curiosity Cake. Curiosity Cake. Steve, welcome to Curiosity Cake. Thanks very much for giving me your time.
Hello, Lee. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. This is something that I think is very interesting particularly at this kind of time. I just came across you on Twitter. It was actually you do these kind of tweets about people that you come across in your historical research into the Holocaust and things. It's just really, really fascinating topic. And obviously, a very kind of dark period in human history. But your book, I Am Juden, is a really particularly interesting aspect of that I think is really kind of hopeful and courageous kind of story. So if we can maybe start off with just giving listeners a bit of a synopsis of what the book's about.
Yeah, sure. So it's based on a true story of a ordinary Jewish guy caught up in the beginning of the Holocaust, and through chance and fate, really, he found himself impersonating a Nazi officer as a way to survive. He ended up being posted and serving at Auschwitz at the very end of the war, and for about a 2 to 3 year period he was embedded in senior positions in the Nazi party in Krakow. And when I found out about that, I thought it was such an incredible story that he had this dual existence, Nazi by day, Jewish undercover resistance agent by night. And I just had to tell that story in some way. And I Am Juden it was the end of a long, long process in how do I tell this story.
And how did you come across this story in the first place?
I got linked from a website I was on where I was originally reading about a true life case of a guy in America in the 1990s, a Jewish man who ended up joining the Nazi party, and this ultimate act of self-betrayal.
So how does that actually happen?
He was a very messed up, disturbed individual, childhood abuse, drugs, alcohol, and I think it was just an expression of self-hatred that he, rejecting his family and becoming a neo-Nazi, to stick two fingers up to his own roots, I think. And from there, I got to another Jewish Nazi in inverted commas, and that was the story of Haim Michael Klar, who became a Nazi in order to survive the Holocaust. And I just got linked from one page to another and read the story on the Illinois Survivors of the Holocaust webpage, which featured a number of testimonies from Auschwitz survivors who were talking about their guardian angel at the camp, a German officer who would be nice to them, who would give them extra food, blankets, who would spare them from some of the most terrible degradations, who would rescue people from the gas chambers. And there were a number of testimonies about this man who all said, we know that he was Jewish. He was pretending to be a German. He was one of us. He saved hundreds. And that just stayed with me so much that I thought that I've got to do something with that story. I've got to make it known somehow.
And is it Haim Michael Klar? Is this a story that isn't that well known then?
It is not well known at all. Apart from the various stuff I've done about my book, all you will find is this one single page on the Illinois survivors website. I cannot for the life of me figure out why it's not better known. I've tried to do my bit in raising it.
Yeah, because the obvious parallel is something like Oskar Schindler and Schindler's List, and obviously that's
totally
with the movie, it's such a well-known kind of story. But I didn't come across Haim Michael Klar until coming across your book.
No, and I don't think anyone would have done, really. There's a really interesting parallel between those two, because Schindler and Haim Michael Klar, they were in Krakow at the same time. They were both in the ghetto, close to the ghetto at the same time. I actually fictionalize a meeting between them in my book, just a kind of a chance encounter in a bar where neither of them know what the other one is doing in terms of saving lives behind the scenes. But I think there's a reason why Schindler is known, and this comes from something I picked up. But in terms of how the Holocaust has been represented in stories and books and films and TV over the years, there's one particular narrative which has come to take hold, and that is of the righteous Gentile rescuing Jews. And Schindler fulfills that completely. There have been a number of other, cases of that. What has been very underrepresented are the Jewish people who were doing it for themselves. The Jewish resistance movement and the people who refused to accept what was going on and tried to fight back, even though they were ultimately doomed. That is not something which is caught on at all. It's almost like the public is much happier seeing Jews of the time as victims and comfortable in a sense. And when a story comes along to challenge that and portrays them as fighters, it doesn't seem to be taken by big audiences for some reason. Does that make sense?
Yes, that totally makes sense, and it brings to mind really that I think probably Jewish collaboration with Nazis has maybe been a story that's been more told than Jewish resistance.
Yes, I do come across against a lot of nastiness on Twitter with that, with determinedly. Well, I won't say they're just right wing. They are neo-Nazis whose excuse for the Holocaust is, the Jewish police did it to themselves. The Jewish capos of the ghettos, they rounded people up. They sent people off to the camps. They were more zealous than the Nazis, is their line of argument.
Yeah, and I think we can even get into some left-wing interpretations as well of the idea of Jewish people kind of being rich, being part of the Illuminati, being part of a kind of global conspiracy, that sort of thing as well. So it sort of feels a bit like there's kind of attacks from all sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, a friend of mine describes it as the horseshoe model of politics, where the far left and the far right come together and end up saying basically the same stuff, particularly on Israel and Jewish identity.
Yes, and obviously, kind of, we'll obviously talk about Nazis, but National Socialism is a form of socialism, isn't it? So,
yes,
yeah,
I guess it was, but primarily it was nationalism, wasn't it, and everything that went along with that.
Yeah. So your book really it's a fiction book, but you're really basing it on the real life of Haim Michael Klar. But I think you actually started off wanting to write the biography of Klar rather than an actual fiction.
Absolutely, yeah. That was my original dream. I wanted to be as faithful and honest as I could and research his life and tell that story as a biography. But I spent years trying to do that. I just could not get anywhere at all. Literally, the one page I've told you about already on the internet, that was it. I found nothing. I spent time in these various Eastern European cities the places he was, talking to people, going to the museums, talking to the guides, the old people in the Jewish community, and I just couldn't get a handle. I couldn't get anything else than what I already knew, and it wasn't enough to write a biography.
Yeah, and I imagine there's probably more people like him that maybe, similarly courageous and brave, doing similar things that we just don't know about, that are kind of disappearing from history.
They are absolutely disappearing from history, and I thought he was going to disappear as well. And I thought, well, this is it. There's nothing I can do to bring him back.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to forget about it and to move on to the next project, but I couldn't. He just wouldn't let me go. So that's how I eventually decided to write what I think of as a fictionalized biography, where I've given him a different name, but I've kept it as close to what I did know about him. But then I've had to fill in the gaps in between to tell the rest of the story.
Yeah. So what do we actually know about Klar and his life as actual facts?
Well, as a result of publishing the book, I've actually struck up a friendship with one of his relatives who reached out to me, to use that horrible phrase that I try not to use, on Facebook. A guy called Yossi Klar, who's a young guy in Jerusalem. He is Haim Michael Klar's great nephew.
Wow, that must be. I kind of imagine you getting up one day, you've got a message in your inbox, and it's a relative of someone that you discovered and has written a book about. That must be a great feeling.
It was totally the stuff of dreams.
Yeah.
It could have been from a movie. It was wonderful. It happened maybe, I think, a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
We've been WhatsApping and Zooming since then. I still can't quite believe it's happened, but it's been a great thing. So as a result of that, I have found out a little bit more about him.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons why his story is not well known is because Haim Michael came from a extremely orthodox branch of Judaism
Mm-hmm.
that had no contact at all with Gentiles. Some of them, even to this day, aren't even allowed to read my book, for example, his other family members, because it was not written by a Jew. And they are very, very private people.
Mm-hmm.
So Yossi, the nephew, the great nephew I know, his family don't use computers at all. They don't use the internet. Yossi's the only one who does. So he only found out about me, in a sense, because he had, unlike the others in his family, he had made connections with the outside world, with the rest of the non-Jewish world. And that was the only reason he would have ever found out about my book. And he's been able to tell them now that it's out there, and they are actually quite pleased. I was worried about that, whether they would feel invaded or whether their privacy had been, taken away from them. But they were actually really pleased that it had been told. So we do know he came from a very Orthodox Jewish family. He was raised in the Carpathian Mountains around Romania, I think. Yossi will correct me there because the borders have changed. They've been withdrawn a number of times. And as a young man, we don't know exactly how, he was possibly recruited by British military who had a presence in what used to be Palestine. Mm-hmm. And there are links with him, records which we're trying to get hold of to this now, that he was he was an agent of theirs. And because of his great skill with languages, he was fluent in German and he looked Aryan. Mm-hmm. He was able to pass himself off as a German. He was in the SS around Krakow. He did serve. He did end up at Auschwitz in a German uniform. And after the war, he survived. He emigrated to New York. He had a very small family of his own. His wife, tragically, his wife and their daughter died, and he lived on as a childless widower, and himself died in the 1990s in New York. having completely, withdrawn and become a very, very private man, and hadn't told anyone really his story. But meanwhile, he has family left in Israel and Britain and America, who knew what he did, but because of the rules around their orthodoxy, they hadn't told the story to anybody else.
Mm-hmm. So how do you go about, for your novel, actually filling in the blanks between the things that we actually know about him?
I think, as you said a minute ago, that there must have been other people like him who did
Mm-hmm.
the same thing, who led the same kind of dual existence, and we don't know about them. And yes, there were, and there have been biographies written of them, people who played, to use that word, acted a role as Nazis,
Mm-hmm.
and lived this second life. There's a great biography of one, and it's called In the Lion's Den. And his name was Oswald Rufeisen. Mm-hmm. And he did a very similar thing. He rose up through the local police ranks in, I think it was Romania, and went from their police to German police to German military police to the Nazi party, keeping one step ahead of the people who were trying to unmask him. Mm-hmm. And so I've read lots of biographies of people who've done similar things and worked out, okay, if they did it this way, then Haim Michael probably did it in a similar way in terms of evading and the espionage required. So I used different details from different people and patched it together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that really gives you a great microcosm of the experience of Jewish people in Europe around that time, through telling the story of your protagonist as a representation of Klar. He starts off in the Pale of Settlement, and then obviously with Krakow and Auschwitz, you're covering a good kind of period of Jewish history there.
Yeah, that's what I was amazed at when I started writing it. The Russian persecution of Jews in the 1800s, although they never devised anything as fiendish as concentration camps or Auschwitz, mechanized death, but their attacks and persecutions and assaults on the Jewish people, they're just like something from the Holocaust, a different country 100 years before. So I did include some of that just to show how long this has been going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember, I think it was Norwich Cathedral that I visited. I visited Norwich Cathedral, and there's a story there. I can't remember from how long ago it was, but there's a story where there was a child that had been murdered, and the local Jewish community were blamed for it, and that led to Jewish people being expelled from England. So this is a good number of
I remember
centuries ago.
Yeah, well, I remember it. I was at university in Norwich, and I do remember that story.
Yeah, and there's a particular title for it, isn't there, for the expulsion that I can't quite remember either. But you were really talking about a group of people who really throughout their whole history have been persecuted. Obviously the Old Testament, covers some of those stories, but then, when Christianity begins, the Jews weren't particularly favored by, the kind of older style, kind of Christianity of early days that was very harsh and very intolerant. Obviously right up to current days with kind of people's reactions to Israel and things like that.
Yeah, it's been going on. That's always attracted me, just how much they've been persecuted over the years and how dark their existence has been. Mm-hmm. But from that, how much Jewish people, particularly Jewish comedy, it comes from such a place of darkness, but Jewish comedians and writers and script writers are some of the wittiest, most positive, ebullient people in the world. And I've always been fascinated by that gap, or that dichotomy from the darkness to the humour.
Yeah, because when you were talking about the Jewish American who joined the American Nazi Party, it was really making me think of that Curb Your Enthusiasm line. With I forget the person's name now. It's Larry something, isn't it?
Larry David?
Yes, Larry David. He has a line in that where he's accused of being a self-hating Jew, and
self-hating Joe. Yeah,
yeah. So his response is that, well, I hate myself, but it's not because I'm Jewish. Something along those lines. So I was really thinking of that when you were talking about that kind of self-hatred.
It is a phenomenon, the self-hating Jew, which I don't really understand, but yeah. It's almost like an internalization of all of the prejudice in the world that somehow gets turned up, and they turn it in on themselves. And it's like, well, if we're as bad as people say we are, then maybe we are that bad. So maybe Jews are scum.
Yeah, and I think maybe there's parallels with your book and your protagonist character, Michael Klar's life, as you're talking about the kind of privacy that he wanted after his wife and daughter died, and his family not necessarily promoting his story, because really your book is really following someone that is, as you say, leading a double life where he's taken up this position in the SS to actually try and help Jewish people, and he's part of the Jewish Resistance. He was trying to do whatever he can to save and ease the suffering of Jewish people at that time. But in order to keep himself in that position to do that, he also has to do some pretty horrible things as well.
That was the moral ambiguity of it. Yeah, what he would need to do to preserve his identity. And forced into some very dark choices, which I don't know for real if the real Haim Michael Klar had to do, but so many people had to make these decisions, even when it came to, to actually killing themselves as a way of showing other Germans that, of who they were in that sense. Yeah, fascinating grey ground for a writer, certainly.
So we're talking there about Klar's role in the Jewish Resistance, and you've already said that was a really key element of what you wanted to put out with the book. So can you actually tell us a bit about the Jewish Resistance, to give us some background?
Yeah, so they were most prominent in two cities, in Warsaw, which is occupied Poland, and Krakow, and also in Lithuania, in what was then Vilna, Vilnius today. These cities were huge places for Jewish populations prior to the Holocaust, and they were big university towns. And the Jewish resistance rose from youth movements within kind of like the equivalent of Sunday school. I'm not sure what it is in Jewish culture, where they would meet together and do Bible readings, but also do self-defense classes, because they were getting picked on in the town by the usual thugs. So it had quite a militant wing to it. It was quite communist, although it split off into lots of different factions. And the young people in that rose very quickly in the 40s to be leaders of this resistance movement, because nobody else was doing it. And they were often only kids, 20 years old, some of them teenagers, seeing what was happening to their parents, seeing their parents being taken out in trucks and never coming back. So they formed this a loose coalition of resistance cells, networks, and they tried to promote rebellions in the ghettos, uprisings. So they were stealing guns from Germans. They were going on bombing campaigns. They were blowing up bridges, railway stations, acts of sabotage, derailing trains that were bound for concentration camps. And they caused the Germans a lot of headaches. It was driving Hitler mad because he knew that they had the expanse or the might of the German army, and yet there were this small handful of civilian Jewish teenagers who were making absolute fools out of them. And their bravery and strength and courage has never really been told, I don't think. You could count the number of films and books about them. There's maybe 4 or 5 of them. I don't understand that either. It needs to be much better known, I think.
Yeah, because we're really familiar with the French resistance, aren't we?
Yes, totally. That's been mythologized, hasn't it, to a great degree.
Yeah. And even to the extent of, when I was a kid, the TV show Allo Allo.
Totally.
I wonder if I possibly know more about the French resistance from that than, but there's no, I can't really think off the top of my head of any kind of media representations of Jewish resistance.
You'd have to look at, there's a TV movie starring David Schwimmer from Friends, of course, called Uprising, which is about the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto, which is probably quite well known today. How the German army were fought off for about 5 days, I think, by a small group of Jews in the heart of the ghetto who were just refusing the final liquidation. And there was this huge siege. You see it in the film The Pianist.
Yeah, The Pianist is the one thing that's really come to mind.
Yeah. And so you've got Uprising, you've got The Pianist, you've got Leon Uris's book Mila 18, which is about the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto. And that's about it.
I'm definitely adding some items to my book list from this conversation anyway.
Wonderful stories.
But you've sort of hinted there of different kind of political views and political ideologies within the resistance. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
It is, and I think it's probably a reason why they weren't more successful, because they were so divided. I mean, there were Jews, for example, who welcomed the creation of the ghettos. So when, for example, the Jewish people of Krakow or the surrounding area were told, by this date, you need to move into this 3 square mile area and you will be assigned housing in there. There are a number of Jews who thought, this is good for us. Finally, we've got a place of safety we can go to. It will be ours. We'll all be there together. We can look after each other. Other Jews who'd seen what happened in other capitals and who already knew this pattern that the ghetto was not going to be a safe place at all. It was essentially just a holding ground until they could be transferred to a concentration camp. They were trying to tell other Jews in their community of what was happening with the trains and the gas stations, but nobody believed it. It was so impossibly far-fetched at that point.
Yeah, there's something really about it, isn't there, that if something like that was to start happening now, today, you would find it very difficult to believe it was happening.
Absolutely. I mean, the parallel to me at the moment is what's happening to the Muslim population in China, the Uyghurs.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think there's evidence that they are being exterminated, but just the idea of being rounded up and put into labor camps based on their ethnicity. And the scale it seems to be happening, it's a terrifying thing. And I wonder, it's strange to see not an even bigger world reaction to it, I think.
Yeah, I think there's some things coming out about them being involved in producing solar cells and things like that. I think we probably have, I don't know if it's naivety or idealism, but we probably have an idea of humans that we wouldn't ever really go that far.
Certainly at the time, at the beginning of the 1940s, nobody had any idea what the Germans would actually be capable of. So it was such a far-fetched notion, extermination camps, gas chambers. But that's why there wasn't a bigger fight back from the Jews, because until it was too late when they did find out what was actually happening, I think.
And within those group of Jewish people who did know what was going on and were advocating for some kind of resistance, were there competing ideas within that group as well?
Yep. The Life of Brian, the People's Front of Judea versus the Judean People's Front, and it was like that, obviously without the slapstick comedy. But you had advocates of passive resistance to, seizing the machine guns and blowing up as many Nazis as we can, to just keeping your head down and hoping it will blow away, to military tacticians who were into espionage. It was such a patched together, loose affiliation of people who were just motivated by survival, but couldn't really coalesce anything substantial around that.
Again, to go back to the idea of your character, there's a real fine line that he's walking between his actions that he has to do to maintain the Nazi identity that he's taken for himself, to give himself that platform to actually help Jewish people. That sounds like an incredibly difficult thing to write.
It was difficult, but I've always been, I don't know where it came from, I've always been fascinated by the idea of dual identities, whether it's going back to a story like Jekyll and Hyde, which terrified me as a young kid, and this notion of good and evil wrapped up in one body, and someone good having to do evil acts in order to do more good acts. I don't actually find it difficult to write. It's the thing possibly I enjoy most about creating characters, I think.
Yeah, your fascination with that idea kind of helps drive the writing for it.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a loose trilogy in mind of undercover, because this one was I Am Juden, undercover in the SS. I've got two more kind of historical books in mind of similar espionage stories. So it's really something that I do. Enjoy is not quite the right word, but that compels me dramatically. I just find it so compelling.
Yeah, and obviously you're having to write about some particularly traumatic events. How does that affect you emotionally as you're writing that? And
it was a grueling period. There wasn't a day go by where I wasn't reading page after page after page of just atrocity, and visiting, Auschwitz and various centers firsthand as well. It was tough. It was bleak. I think eventually I became numb to it to a degree, just to get through. But what kept me going was the idea of finding moments of kindness, finding moments of positivity, finding small moments of joy and resistance amidst the darkness. That's what I kept looking for.
And you spoke a bit about fleshing out the facts that you know about Michael Klar to create the novel. How did you go about fleshing out the Nazi characters in it?
The vast majority, well, all of them, in fact, are are real positions of real, authority. The Hans Frank, the governor of occupied Poland, to the various people he meets in the camps and in the ghetto, the head of Krakow ghetto, William Kund. Amon Goth, of course, portrayed so memorably and chillingly by Ralph Fiennes in Schindler's List. Amon Goth was the architect of the killing squads around occupied Poland. His officers were just lethal and psychotic, and so they were all real people. There's a lot written about them. I knew they were all in this same place at the same time as Haim Michael Klar, so I read a lot of their biographies, just painstakingly collated details together. So I know he was here, for example, in Lublin on this day, and then Hans Frank was here and they had this meeting. So what did they do between here and then? His family was here, so what would he have been doing? What would his house have been like? And it was just building up, almost like a painting, kind of layer by layer by layer, until they began to seem real to me.
And again, talking about Warsaw and Krakow and the ghettos, what would it have been like to live there for just ordinary Jewish people?
It was like, I think at the very beginning, it might have been tolerable. And for the first few months, they were left alone in there, and life went on, and they had cabarets, comedy nights, musical theatres that they put on. So life did go on. Gradually, as more and more Jews were forced in there, conditions became intolerable in terms of overcrowding. Diseases like typhus were rife, completely unsanitary, groups of 15 people sharing a living room. That was very quickly led to starvation, and it would not have been unusual at all. You see photographs of it, of dead bodies in streets and people just walking over them to get to the shop or to get to work. So it would have been increasingly surreal, but still some semblance of family life. And then the attack started intensifying under this Nazi phrase of liquidation, which would involve going in and basically, after you've put all the Jews together there, they then would start taking them away. So making selections to go to concentration camps, thinning the herd, so to run the ghetto down so it would eventually be completely empty of Jews. So when that started, when the mass shootings started, when the reports of trains to concentration camps started, very quickly word spread in that completely closed community, and they were scared the crap out of them. Clearly they knew what was coming, and they were trapped there, and a few people that we talked about were trying to subvert it and resist it, but there wasn't a lot they could do.
Yeah, and you can imagine it being an incredibly frightening time as you're watching more and more Jewish people being shipped into the ghettos, while at the same time people being shipped off and disappearing, as well as the attacks going on at the same time. And you put a lot of people together in a confined space with that kind of fear going on as well. Would obviously really kind of ramp that up to like a new level.
The Germans were very good at trying to pacify Jewish fear, because they obviously knew that a terrified population would panic, would become uncontrollable. So there were so many measures in place to reassure them. So, for example, once family were taken out of the ghetto to camps, they were allowed and encouraged to keep sending letters to them, with this idea that, you know, they're being resettled. And for a while, the letters would come back because they weren't killed instantly. So a lot of people still thought, you know, there is hope once you're out of the ghetto. They're going somewhere else. This was what they were told originally, that they would be resettled in the East. So kind of getting towards Russia, you know, they were taking Jews over there where they could go back to living in villages again, as they had in the 1800s. Slowly, people started to realize that resettlement to the East was a euphemism. But they kept that lie going for a long time to tamp down on the fear and the anxiety. And they were just really good at it, the Nazis. You know, they were such a wicked group. They really were. So clever as well.
Yeah, well, the propaganda was very strong, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I suppose in that context, talking about the resistance of, you know, if people knew they were going to die, that puts you in a position of, you know, well, what do I have to lose? I might as well pick up a gun, a bomb, whatever, and fight back.
Yes, and you're right. And the people who did that, they were often people who had escaped from camps, or who had jumped off the lorry and who had witnessed the most terrible things, and they would go running back, and nobody would believe them to start with. But these were the people who became the pioneers of the resistance movement. Yeah, the few people who'd seen firsthand and had escaped, and there just weren't that many who'd ever escaped. So that's another reason why the numbers were small.
So, Steve, the book is self-published. What made you decide to self-publish it?
Well, it wasn't out of choice. I spent the best part of 2 years contacting every literary agent and publisher in the country. It probably had over 200 rejections, at which point I was really about to give up.
Which is, I think that's the standard experience of people writing and trying to get published, isn't it? I think the books that get published are very rare.
It's so hard. Unless you have a profile already, unless you're famous for something else, it's very hard to get published. I couldn't believe it, just because I don't profess to be any, you know, great prose stylist at all. Words often come out very, very painfully for me, and it's an arduous process. So I don't think I'm much of a writer, but I do think this is an incredible story.
Yeah,
it was
it's
just
very
the
much
idea
so,
of, I couldn't understand why, even if my writing's not great, why the story didn't compel the people I was sending it to, but it didn't. And eventually I was talked into self-publishing by a very good friend who just said, I've got nothing to lose. Rather than the manuscript sitting in a drawer gathering dust, put it out there and see what happens. So I did, and I have to say it was one of the best pieces of advice I've ever had. And it's, as a result of that, it's sold 25,000 copies now, which is
amazing, isn't it?
It is, yeah, it is.
And you're really getting that story of Michael Klar out there.
Yeah, it's everything I wanted to do. Just being the self-publisher, I'm everything. That's what I didn't realize when I began self-publishing. You know, I'm in charge of the proofreading, of the book design, the cover, the paperback, formatting, the marketing, the publicity. It's all me. It's just one guy and a Twitter account, basically.
that sounds like my podcasting career as well.
Yeah, which is great, and I don't mind it, and everything I can do to spread the story. But it does, all of that takes away creative energies that I would rather be spending on writing. So it does. The rest of it the publishing and the promoting side takes up an awful lot of my time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's fantastic. Those are really great numbers, and hopefully, we've introduced you to some new people that'll go and buy the book as well. So, can you tell us how people can find out more about you and where they can get the book?
Yeah, sure. It's an Amazon exclusive. It's not available in any high street stores at the moment. So there's an ebook and a paperback, both of which are on Amazon under I Am Juden, Undercover in the SS.
Fantastic. And you're on Twitter as well?
I am on Twitter, yes, under my name, Stephen Uzzell, and I tweet kind of quite often about figures from the Holocaust, people who aren't so known, the people who did good, the resistance agents, and also charting it through kind of day by day. I tried to post something what was happening on this day, 1942, and there's lots of wonderful archive footage and photographs, and I do my best to keep it alive.
Yeah, and I think you're doing a great job. It's a really great book. I really encourage people to go and read it. The story itself is just a really amazing story about a really amazing person. So Steve, thanks very much. It's been really great talking to you.
That's very kind of you to say, Lee, and thank you for giving me this platform. It's been wonderful having a little chat with you on a Sunday morning. Really enjoyed it.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Remember to rate and review the show on your podcast app and spread the word. And get in touch on Twitter or through the website and let me know what topics you'd like to hear in the future. Bye for now.
Curiosity Cake.